Hey everybody, Stacey Murphy here, and I've been thinking a lot about all of the destruction from the most recent hurricane season. So sometimes when we build our gardens, nature can come through and just wipe it clean in one fell swoop. And I know what that's like. In Brooklyn, I farmed for several years, and in those several years, we experienced 2 hurricanes which wiped us out completely. I experienced a tornado, which landed a giant motorcycle in our eggplant. We also had a hailstorm, which turned our entire farm into what looked like coleslaw, an entire farm of just coleslaw. So I have a sense of what happens in the destruction when nature comes through in one fell swoop and just wipes out your garden. I know how heartbreaking it can be, so I thought I would create a video specifically for those people who have gone through some flooding and what to do with your vegetable garden. All right, so I know this is a tricky subject to talk about. It's probably still pretty raw for you, but I want to give you some pointers. And even if you've never experienced any flooding in your garden, this is going to be really useful in the case that it might happen, and also help you think about how you might prevent it from happening if you're in an area that might be flood prone. That's a tough word to say. All right, so the first thing is, your soil is precious. So what I want you to think about is, you're not going to walk on really wet soil because that's going to hurt the structure of that soil. So you want to basically, you don't work the soil, you don't walk on it, allow it to basically dry out. So what you're doing is you're waiting. It's a long waiting game potentially depending on your soil structure. So if you have a sandy soil, it's going to drain that water pretty quickly. But if you have a clay soil, that water could stick around for a while, and you really need to wait and wait and wait for that water to dissipate before you really go out there and start mucking around, because you can really damage your soil in the long run. You don't want to do that. And so what's happening out there in this waiting period, you really want to wait, is that if your soil is waterlogged, all the soil biology underground is basically gasping for oxygen. It's basically, it's drowning. And so what'll happen above ground, the plants, they can't get the oxygen that they need, and so you're going to see drooping plants, you're going to see yellow leaves, you're going to see withering, and it's not a sign that the plants need more water, it's a sign that they are oxygen deprived. So you just have to wait and know that the soil is still really waterlogged, all right? So what's happening in that waterlogged moment is that all of the bacteria that need oxygen are dying off, and the bacteria, the anaerobic bacteria that don't mind breeding in those conditions where there is no oxygen, they're going to populate the area, and those are the ones that kind of stink. They smell funny, so when you go outside, you're going to find a kind of sour smell, and that's because of that waterlogging of the soil. So your soil biology is going to return as long as you had good soil biology to begin with. It's just going to take some time. So waiting is so important, all right? So after you wait, and the way that you know is that basically you stick a trowel into the soil and about 6 inches down and kind of wiggle it back and forth. And if there's a big pool of water in there, it's still waterlogged. If it looks dry, if you stick the trowel in 6 inches deep and you wiggle it around and it's dry in there, grab a handful of soil, squeeze it, and if water is coming down your arm, it's still too wet. You want to wait until when you squeeze it, it's like a damp sponge, and there's no water coming out of it, but it holds together. So that's what you're looking for. And at that point, the wait is over, all right? At that point, there's going to be a bunch of emotions that are basically going through you while you wait. And I just want to talk about that for a brief moment. So the emotions that went through me, I went through anger and, all of the emotions and grief. This is a moment of destruction in your garden, right? So take a moment to grieve the garden and move through some of that sorrow of all that work that you put in. Hopefully you were able to harvest everything before the flood came along. And that's one of the big recommendations I have, is if you know a flood is coming, get all that food out of the garden because it's useless afterwards. So take a moment to grieve the destruction, and then also take a moment to be grateful for everything that you did in this garden to build a healthy ecosystem so that you know that it can bounce back over time. All right, so take a moment to just be so grateful that it does exist and that you have an opportunity here to rebuild. All right, so take a moment and go through some of that emotional work because it's important to the process, right? You just got to take a moment sometimes and, be angry and swear a bit, right? And then, so the wait is over, let's say, and in that wait, one of the things that you can be doing is creating an action plan. So you may not be able to make an exact action plan, but what you can do is you can look out and you can see which areas of your yard had the most amount of flooding. And so now you can say, okay, well, this area was very stagnant and this area dried up pretty quickly. So maybe this area that dried up more quickly, maybe that's where I focus my future efforts with vegetable gardening so that in the future the flooding happens below it, let's say, and it doesn't happen here. Maybe you don't have a choice where your vegetable garden is, and maybe you put in place some swales where it kind of you direct the water to another location around your vegetable bed. And I know in heavy rains, if you experience flooding of a couple feet, obviously there's nothing really that you can do at that point. If you have a small yard, if you have a big yard, you might be able to put some earthworks in place that can actually direct a lot of that water. So it just depends on how big your space is, what your possibilities are, and it's too big of a topic to go into here. But a couple things is, if you're experiencing minor flooding, a couple inches, just creating raised beds, wooden boxes that are up a couple feet can distance you from that flooding. So that's something else that you can do as well. You could even build tables. If you're in an area that gets a lot of flooding all the time, you could build your garden on tables and roll them around and roll them inside when the flooding is coming. And hopefully where you aren't experiencing the kind of flooding where it's coming through the houses and through everything. So it's going to vary depending on how much water we're talking about, but there's some action plans that you can take to see what are the high points, what are the low points, where is the stagnant water happening, what areas are draining well, what areas are not draining well. And you don't want to put your garden in a low-lying, non-draining spot because that's going to be very prone to flooding if that's what's happening in your area. All right, so we've gone through all the different steps. We've been waiting, and at this point, it is time to rebuild. And one of the things you need to do is clean everything out. And I mentioned that you don't want to walk on soil when it's wet and you don't want to work soil when it's wet because you can break the structure of that soil and do some long-term damage. So after the wait is over, you're going to go out and potentially you're going to take everything out and you're going to start from scratch. And the reason why I say potentially is that stormwater is full of contaminants. You might have sewage contaminants, you might have hydrocarbons in there, you might have random household items from if this was a serious flood and water came through people's houses and landed in your yard, there's no telling what's in there, all kinds of chemicals, all kinds of household chemicals. And so this is a moment for you to figure out, all right, what do I need to test for in my yard before I start rebuilding a garden? A lot of people will tell you don't plant anything for 90 days, and that's going to help with any kind of sewage that may have landed in your garden. That's going to help with that decomposition. But what doesn't decompose are all of the chemicals in the sewage system. Those are things that are potentially still in your garden, and they're going to leach through the soil and leach through the water over time. And the other thing that's going to leach through are all the nutrients that were in your soil. So when you go to rebuild, you're going to have to put in place, you're going to have to add those nutrients back in and make sure it's a very fertile location. Lots of compost teas in order to replenish the soil biology and bring that balance back. So this rebuilding is going to take some time, and you might want to get some testing done if you're in an area that had severe flooding, just to find out what you're dealing with. And there is a lot of ways to rejuvenate and regenerate soil using plants and using fungi. There are ways to remediate the soil if needed, but the first thing you really need to do is take stock and understand what's there so that you can work to remediate it. So I do recommend a soil test afterwards, and in order to know what to test for, you have to take a look around and say, okay, was it just some regular flooding? Was it just some storm runoff? In which case, more than likely, you're dealing with a little bit of sewage maybe. Or was it a massive flooding and potentially your neighbor's insulation with all those toxic chemicals has landed in your garden? So you have to make that call and do some testing. You might want to bring in fresh soil from a known source that you could put on top, build up again. So it's going to vary depending on what happened with you, but just know that all of those edibles that went through a flood, they're not edibles anymore. You have no idea what's on that food, and washing it is not going to wash away all of the potential toxins that are on that. One of the reasons why I wanted to shoot this video is that as a gardener, I know that you are changing the face of the planet, literally. Your garden is helping to rebuild the soil on this planet, to store carbon, and these are things that can help to mitigate climate change. And climate change is what is causing a lot of the mass destruction, these really large events where there's a lot more moisture in the air. The earth is heating up, so there's a lot more vapor in the air, which means larger storms, which means more flooding. So basically, your garden is the key to reversing some of that climate change. And obviously, all of our gardens, all of our farms, whenever people are rejuvenating soil, that's what we're up to. And so your garden plays a big role in that, which is why I want you to rebuild. I want you to have a more resilient garden in the future so that we can all enjoy a more resilient future. You're a key component, and I know you can do this. I look forward to those future images of your garden, and I'm here with you. I understand the heartbreak, and I look forward to hearing the ways in which you have addressed flooding in your area. All right, take care, and I will see you on the next video.